I love how Spectacular Spider-Man, and for all intents and purposes, the 90s Spider-Man show before it, handled the symbiote arc. I think the symbolism between the symbiote and addiction is wonderful. As well, I just think the arcs are very well handled. But there is something I do want to address about the symbiote as an entity before I address the entirety of it in Spectacular Spider-Man. If you actually already know the history of the symbiote in the comics, there'll be a time code on screen you can skip to. Otherwise, I just want to take a moment to speak about what the symbiote was like before the 90s cartoon. The symbiote was never actually a metaphor for addiction, nor did it ever make Peter angry or more aggressive or anything like that at all. As a matter of fact, the symbiote itself did a lot more to help Peter than harm. It's just that when Peter found out the symbiote was essentially wearing him while he slept, it became really awkward and weird, and so he went to the Fantastic Four only to find out that the symbiote was a living being trying to bond with him, in which he took the symbiote off. It was that taking off process and the symbiote being separated from what it considered to be its perfect host that drove it mad and angry. That was later retconned to Deadpool had the symbiote on, and that's what made the symbiote crazy because it adopts some type of personality of its first wearer. And then that was kind of soft retconned again into saying like all symbiotes want the best for their hosts, and that was kind of again soft retconned by the whole appearance of Null and his entire existence in comic books. But the symbiote retcons aside, has, at least in the comics historically, never been at a precedent of making Spider-Man more aggressive or angry. It was truly the 90s Spider-Man show that popularized that idea, which has bled over not only into the comics, but just about every single adaptation of the symbiote that has come, whether it be through cartoons or movies or any adaptation that is not the comics directly. And so when I spoke last video about the symbiote being a metaphor for addiction, I always meant it as in the adaptations. We see it in Spider-Man 2, the video game most recently. We've seen it in just about every adaptation of the suit since its inception outside of the comic books. And I love the symbiote in the comics. I think the idea is really novel and cool, and I also think it's probably more beneficial than harmful there. Although, shout out the time it was slowly killing Eddie, but also keeping him alive. Again, lots of weird retcons with the symbiote because it's just been around for so long. Anyways, I felt like that distinction was needed to be made, especially because I got a lot of comments mentioning that last video, and I just wanted to address it and say, yes, I know this, but for all intents and purposes and the purposes of this video specifically, the symbiote acts as though it is the exact same in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, and so I will be speaking at it from that directive. It is also worth noting that a majority of this video, when I talk about addiction, I am speaking at it from the mental and emotional dependency on addiction, and I am not speaking on the physical part of being addicted, which are two very separate sides of the same coin with addiction. You can be mentally addicted or physically addicted. I am specifically talking about the mental aspect and the emotional aspect, and not more so the physical. So keep that in mind when I speak on that or any part of that throughout the rest of this video. So, without any further ado, let's talk about the symbiote and Spider-Man's arc throughout the last few episodes in what is probably one of the best season finales I have ever watched of a TV show. I spent a lot of the last video talking about Harry. As a matter of fact, I spent probably the first 22 minutes of the video speaking on Harry, simply because I believe the parallel between him and Peter is quite big. The more and more Peter used the symbiote and the more he relied on it, the more he ended up turning into what Harry was when he was off the Goblin Green. He is spending a lot of his time pushing his friends away in the most nonsensical way possible. He's just honestly being an angry douche about everything. It doesn't help that Eddie isn't necessarily being the best of friends currently, but he is really lacking some sort of rod to properly ground him to reality, much like Harry was. Although I believe the big difference between Pete and Harry is that the fact that Peter, despite having severe money issues, especially when it comes to paying for Aunt May, truly had a support system around him. As a matter of fact, we see his friends rally to his aid, and it's damn near the whole cast of the show whereas Harry didn't have something like that. But that doesn't stop Peter in giving his masterclass version of Harry's speech to Gwen, the only person that cared about him. The two speeches are honestly very similar.
We're just trying to be your friends.
Yeah, well, unless my friends are prepared to pony up some cash, they can keep their help. And their sympathy. And what am I even doing here?
Pete!
I mean, he had quite literally just a few episodes prior spent time with dealing with the fallout of not only Harry going away, but finding out he's the Green Goblin, and finding out that Harry had an addiction that led him to being the worst version of himself. And yet, despite seeing all of the warning signs, he fell into the exact same trap, because the symbiote makes it easy. It makes the idea of doing something immoral very easy. And that's not a slight against Peter as a person, because without this substance, or the symbiote in this case, he wouldn't have been like this. It changes you on a fundamental level, and we see that when he is more than willing to accept a payout from Tombstone, if it means not only getting to pay for Aunt May, but also getting a little bit of easier time in just being Peter Parker. He doesn't believe Jameson will pay him enough for photos, so he needs to go looking for another source of revenue. He ultimately chooses Tombstone. He decides to take him up on the offer and turn a blind eye to crime. He is fundamentally going against his own characteristics, and to me, that is a key sign of substance abuse disorder. The symbiote started off as something that was really helpful for Peter, something that could help him balance not only his life as Peter Parker, but also his life as Spider-Man. That to me is the honeymoon phase of addiction. And as we slowly see it take over his life, he doesn't speak about himself anymore. It's no longer I's, it's all we's. It becomes a sole part of him. I think Spectacular Spider-Man does the best job of any adaptation of the symbiote at doing the addiction metaphor, in my opinion. And I truly enjoy that it also not only gives us a look at Peter going through addiction, but two other characters as well, those being Harry and one other that I will get to talking about nearer towards the middle point of this video. Peter by this point is so deep into it that when his best friend expresses a grievance with him, well, aggressively, Peter handles it with his spider powers and not being Peter Parker. He's pretty much gone off the rails by this point, and as a matter of fact, it takes Flash Thompson of all people to ground him back to reality.
Poor puny Parker. Even Sally feels bad for you, but not me. If you're hanging up on the she-geek, that proves you're still a stuck-up egghead. A guy who can't even see when his friends are trying to help.
The key difference, so when he was deep into his addiction, he truly only had Gwen. Peter has a whole village behind him. And this is something I harped on a lot in the last video, and I also harped on in my Spider-Man 2 analysis video, which is that the best way to beat an addiction is to have people around you willing to support you, even if you're at your lowest as a person. It's through having that support of other people that Peter was even able to make marginal gains in trying to get away from his addiction. The symbiote decides to play a lot on Peter's past and his traumas as he is trying to get rid of it. Not only does this serve as the audience as an amazing way for us to see Peter's backstory in this movie universe, which is kind of somewhat similar to Tobey Maguire's at the time, funnily enough, but it also allows us to see how the symbiote plays on this, how it plays on Peter's emotions and is beckoning him to just release. That morality has no real cause or stake if it makes him a better Spider-Man. It calls to him at the lowest point of not only his current life, but also where he was in the past, promising that he will never have to face something so devastating once again if he only gives in and accepts the symbiote for what it is. And that's one of, at least in my opinion, the hallmarks of an addiction. It promises that things will never have to be so bad again. It fills that void, especially when people are starting to miss it. And Peter almost accepts if it wasn't for the guiding light of his Uncle Ben, someone who was always there for Peter and always served as a moral compass. It takes Uncle Ben being there to remind Peter of everything he has. It also serves to give us my second favorite Uncle Ben with Great Responsibility speech ever.
You're changing. into the man you're going to be. And just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. With great power, there must also come great responsibility.
Uncle Ben's entire purpose in this episode is to remind Peter of the good things that he has in his life, to remind Peter of why he chose to not only be Spider-Man, but why taking the moral high ground for the most part is the right thing to do. I love the idea that the symbiote tries to play on Spider-Man saving people as almost a negative, as though it is causing and holding him back. But instead, Uncle Ben takes those same memories and plays them as positives, spinning them in a light to show that Peter not only has an amazing support group, but also has the ability to affect people in a way he doesn't think of. There's a reason most of Midtown High rallies behind him, at least the Midtown High that we see in the show, when he is hurting like that. I know I didn't have a spot in this for the script, but Black Cat appearing in all the like good, helpful, good guy Spider-Man montages is kind of hilarious to me. And even when Peter is at his absolute lowest and completely drowning, Uncle Ben is still there with his unconditional support. Peter's support network is always there. This is one of my favorite scenes on screen. Hopefully copyright doesn't make me get rid of it. And it is genuinely through the power of friendship that Peter Parker is able to finally kick the symbiote permanently. Now, you may be saying it's hard to get a support group. I've seen a lot of people comment this on the previous video, that having a support group isn't just the only answer. And that is 100% true. You as a person must make the choice to change first and must recognize what is wrong. It's just that having people around you tends to help with that process. It becomes a lot easier to kick an addiction when you have that support group around you. It could be something as little as going to AA meetings, for example. The idea of having a support group that not only holds you accountable, but you hold them accountable is the #1 way of fighting addiction. And with that, I'm going to step off my soapbox. I have an entire half-hour video dedicated to that. And if you would like to go watch it, I'll hopefully put a link in the description. I better remember that. And with Peter thoroughly kicking the symbiote addiction, he is finally able to destroy it and get rid of it. But in the process, he also ends up destroying the only chance Eddie Brock had of getting his job back. You may be wondering, I haven't exactly spoken of Eddie Brock almost at all throughout this retrospective of like the first season. And that's because I didn't want to talk about him till near the end. Eddie Brock has been in just about every single-ish episode. I think he's been about half the season. I take that back. But throughout the season, we see that they took a much more Ultimate Spider-Man approach with Eddie Brock's characterization in this show. That being, him and Peter are extremely close. They are almost like brothers to each other. And Eddie Brock has been said to have protected Peter throughout a majority of high school. But Eddie Brock, unlike Peter, was an orphan post losing their parents. He didn't have anyone, and the few friends and people he latched onto were getting absolutely ran through in this show. For example, he was a fairly decent friend of Max Dillon, and well, Max Dillon ends up having to make Max Dillon feel human anymore, no matter how much time Eddie tries to spend with him. And we see that Eddie continuously tries to put himself out there for the people that he cares about. We see Eddie quite literally lose one of his only friends to being a living being of energy and no longer having the ability to, well, function sanely as a person. I mean, who would? And then when things slowly start to get better, hell, even his boss manages to regrow his arm using a lizard serum he was working on, somebody who Eddie is shown to be fairly close to. It all goes completely wrong. That lizard serum is slowly and completely turning Kurt Connors into the lizard. A grotesque monster that quite literally Peter a majority of the time. Eddie doesn't have an aunt. Eddie, we never see any of his college friends. We're almost told to assume he doesn't have any. So he is willing to go to bat and damn near die for a lot of these people in the show, specifically Kurt Connors, just by helping Spider-Man. We also see the same thing happen in the Electro episode, where he puts himself on the line and at risk to try and protect his friends from Electro. So it's this huge stab in the back to him when his oldest and closest friend, somebody he has spent not only the last few episodes trying to protect, but a majority of what sounds like high school trying to protect backstab him by, instead of working on a cure to try and help his mentor in Kurt Connors, instead of doing that, Peter chooses to take photos and pictures of the lizard, being selfish in Eddie's gaze. This to him feels like a huge backstab from somebody who in his eyes has it all.
The lizard. And that's supposed to... Bro, you ditched the antidote effort to win a contest.
Eddie, it's all right.
But yet, despite all of this, Eddie still viewed Peter as his brother and didn't really take any repercussions outside of simply saying that he needed some time away from Peter Parker, and that's perfectly fine to do in a situation like this. But he also didn't cut Peter off completely, mainly because I think Eddie, despite it not being told to him, genuinely knows about Peter's struggles when it comes to his finances. As well, him and Gwen just kind of hang out the rest of the season. You might be wondering why I haven't spoke about Gwen. I think she deserves her own video, or maybe something different or akin to that. She deserves her own little look, and that'll happen eventually. But speaking more on Eddie Brock himself, it's not exactly the greatest move when you're already on the ropes with your friends, and then you show up with a new girl at prom when it's so blatantly obvious to everybody but Peter that Gwen has a major crush on him. And Eddie, though, doesn't really hold this against Peter necessarily, but he does take note of the fact that, like, Peter isn't actually taking care of the people around him, if that makes sense. And to make everything even worse, the next time we see Peter actually interact with Eddie Brock is when Peter needs something from Eddie. Their relationship by this point has been fairly repaired, but Peter's next interaction to Eddie is quite literally him calling to ask if he can see the ooze. To Eddie, that doesn't ring any alarm bells yet, but when Peter goes to see the ooze and takes photos of it being stolen but doesn't call the cops, obviously we know he's Spider-Man, the whole chameleon thing. For us, that's a different way of looking at it, but for Eddie, all he sees is Peter once again taking advantage of a situation in order to get pictures and to get money and take care of himself first, without thinking about the repercussions that may come for other people. And this was finally Eddie's broken straw. Despite Peter having every single advantage, he is still taking advantage of situations.
I actually thought Spidey was a hero. And I actually thought Pete was a human being. But he was here last night taking pictures and couldn't even be bothered to call the police.
But
Don't bother, Gwen. Bro had his second chance. I'm done.
This was quite honestly it for Eddie's relationship with Peter in any sort of semblance. I think it's really dope that they give him this black leather jacket that looks like the Venom symbiote. It's just great symbolism shown throughout the show, much like how the symbiote slowly takes over Spider-Man, getting rid of the webbing and the lines. But in totality, Eddie essentially is done being friends with Peter and is done doing anything having to do with him at all. But also that means Eddie is completely cut off and disconnected. He no longer has the person he's been closest to throughout the entirety of this show. He doesn't really have friends on ESU's campus. He doesn't have anyone, and he is lashing out hard. His sense of moral compass doesn't really exist, as the dude was at one point an orphan, and the next thing you know, he had Peter, but he doesn't really have Peter. Which leads to the most questionable decision I think I've ever seen when it came to this show, and it just leaves me wondering, we need to stop and talk about this. Eddie Brock is implied to be a freshman at ESU, meaning he's in college, so he's an adult, right? He's an adult. Spider-Man in this show is implied to be going into his junior year of high school, so Pete's about 16, which would most likely make Mary Jane about 16 years old. Eddie Brock didn't meet Mary Jane until Peter invited her to prom. Mind you, Eddie is already in college, so he is an adult, and Mary Jane is probably 16 years old. What the hell is he doing going on a faux date with her? Because the way the show implies it, it's a date. It's a date between the two of them. So why is Eddie Brock Jr. going on a date with a 16-year-old? It would be different if it was like him and Gwen. It's implied that those two grew up together and knew each other for a long time. Maybe they met while they were still at the same high school in high school. But this is an 18-year-old grown-ass man meeting a 16-year-old for the first time and then going out with her like a month later. Well, I know it's probably just there to go to show like how morals got thrown out of the window. Eddie Brock is intentionally going after something to try and hurt Peter. Like, again, I kind of get that. But at the same time, it's like, bro, I don't know if the creative team were fully cognizant of this, or if, like, maybe in 2007 this wasn't as big of a deal. But to me, this is like setting off huge alarm bells and just so wrong. And I felt like it needed to be addressed, I guess. Either way, we'll just chalk it up to Eddie Brock doesn't have a moral compass, mainly because he had nobody to guide him, unlike Peter having Uncle Ben or his support system around him. We've been shown time and time again, Eddie just doesn't have that. And even Harry somewhat had someone, quote unquote, with his father. Brock has nobody. It's still inexcusable though, and you should never do this. And if you see something like this, it is definitely weird. Especially if it doesn't matter who's the older party in the situation, man or woman, it's weird. This part of the episode also serves to give us a decent amount of backstory when it comes to Eddie Brock and Peter's relationship and why they were so close, as well as, again, showing that Eddie has nobody.
Same old story. Two kids who grew up together. Our moms were best friends. Our dads were partners. They had a startup lab in Queens. And then the four of them went to a conference together. And there was this funny little plane crash.
I very much believe that the show hinted at the resentment Eddie had for Peter throughout a majority of the show, and while it was somewhat downplayed, it is true that Eddie Brock himself had some sort of resentment for Peter, because in his eyes, Peter had Aunt May, Peter had the friends, he had the experiences, Peter was smart, he didn't have to work really hard in school. To Eddie Brock, Peter had it all. He had everything that he would have wanted, and yet Peter kept taking and taking and taking. So Eddie wanted to take something of his in the form of Mary Jane, although this backfires spectacularly in one of my favorite MJ moments from this show.
He may not be perfect, but whatever his faults, he's twice the man you'll ever be.
I think this is very clearly evidenced with the fact that Eddie Brock goes to see Aunt May even when Peter isn't there, and seems extremely resentful of the fact that Peter hasn't even bothered to visit his aunt, who's been at the hospital for over 24 hours. And just to make all of these matters even worse, because they lost funding, not only because of the lizard incident, the electro incident, but because of the ooze, Eddie doesn't have a job anymore.
Lab can no longer afford to keep you on the payroll.
But I need that money. Without it, I'll have to drop out of VSU.
Not nearly as iconic as losing his apartment, his job, and his health, but still really cements just how Eddie Brock is feeling about Peter at this point. And when Eddie goes to vent, even though he does so in a pretty aggressive manner, Peter pretty much just goes all Spider-Man on him. And for Eddie, this is it. This is the last straw for him. He has nothing left. No connections, no nothing. But Spider-Man presented, quite honestly, the one light that he could have had. The ability to save his job by giving the symbiote back. But Spider-Man chose to freeze it, which would keep Eddie out of a job and keep him miserable and unhappy. This leaves him rife for the symbiote, who is angry about being separated from Peter Parker and Spider-Man, to latch on to Eddie. Obviously, the symbiote needs someone to survive, but when it realizes that Eddie's emotions are perfect and ready for manipulation, that's exactly what it does. The symbiote provides an easy out for Eddie. He no longer has to logically think about, all of the fact that Spider-Man did a lot more helping than harming, and that Peter is Spider-Man, but instead he is able to completely give in to the symbiote. This is Eddie finally being able to take the easy route in his life when he has been forced to take the hard route and basically get out the mud ever since he was a child, ever since he lost his family. For him, this is finally the easy way out. He doesn't have to think hard anymore. It's finally going to be everything he has ever wanted. And so he accepts the symbiote with no recourse and no willingness to let go of it. Side note, I absolutely love the black and white displays and symbiote era stuff.
We will have our desire! Yes! We will have vengeance on Spider-Man!
And while Eddie Brock is losing it and descending towards giving up what made him human in the first place, Peter, on the other hand, is absolutely vibing out. Dude is back to being Spider-Man, doing typical Spider-Man things. We get a really dope action scene of him back in red, and his life, for all intents and purposes, while not perfect, is getting back on track. He tells Tombstone to shove it where the sun doesn't shine and that he's no longer going to be avoiding fighting crime. He lets him know that no amount of money is ever going to make him turn into the person that Tombstone wants him to be. As well, he goes out of his way to spend time with his Aunt May, and even at school decides to help repair the relations that he more or less ruined with his friendships. And they all accept him. And he even goes out of his way to thank Flash Thompson.
Hey, just the other day? I must be slipping.
Thanks for the reality check.
Don't mention it. And I mean not to anyone.
Hey, Petey.
While Peter is rallied and supported by everybody, I think his interaction with Flash Thompson is the most poignant. Also, shout out Rand for being absolutely cool with everything. We love you, Rand. Robbie's son is the GOAT. But regardless, while everybody else is quick to forgive him and to treat Peter very well, I think Flash Thompson's treatment speaks volumes. It was revealed later in Season 2 that Flash and Peter both were very close when they were younger, but not so much anymore. And, well, in all honesty, it's really nice to see Flash actually being kind to Peter. Reminds me a lot of The Amazing Spider-Man, where Flash Thompson is kind to Peter after he loses Uncle Ben. But even with everything going so right, there are still a few things going fairly wrong. MJ insists on telling Peter about what happened with Eddie Brock, and this kind of weighs on Peter in a way. He's not exactly feeling at his best, and he's not exactly feeling like Spider-Man being Spider-Man is really helping as many people as he thinks. Despite everything that he just went through, the idea of being Spider-Man still weighs heavily on his mind and makes him wonder if it's even at all worth it. Because at the end of the day, he does this out of being selfless. He doesn't do it for the thrill. He doesn't do it because he enjoys being a superhero or because for his family, that's just what they are. For Spider-Man, for Peter, this is a way of saving lives and of helping as many people as possible. Something he had forgotten when he was using the symbiote and something he had to rediscover throughout the last few episodes. Oh, and we also get some of the best action sequences throughout this entire show in this episode because Spider-Man and Venom are just going band for band the entire episode. It's honestly so peak. But Venom's entire plan is to quite literally go after who Spider-Man cares about most. And just like how Eddie Brock misunderstood Spider-Man, or Peter in this case, caring about MJ the most, it took him bonding with the Venom symbiote to realize Peter loves Gwen, and that is so obviously clear to just about everybody in this show. Like, Peter and Gwen were day one forever, but what makes it even more insane for me is that, like, Eddie himself genuinely puts Gwen in danger, somebody who he sees as almost like a younger sibling, and somebody he has cared for a majority of this season, and he willingly puts her in danger just to get back at Peter. That just shows how far gone he is when he's with the symbiote than without. I think the most beautiful and poetic way that this entire arc ends is not only with Peter realizing that he needs to protect the ones he loved in Gwen and that Gwen is actually his real love, but also in realizing that Peter himself doesn't just do it alone. I love the idea that a majority of Peter's friends at the school rally around to save Gwen, and that's the reason she doesn't die. Not because Spider-Man was able to save her, but because the people around the two of them were truly able to save her. Combine all of that with a scene of Peter more than willing to take the demon away from Eddie and back into himself, knowing that he is strong enough to handle it and Eddie is not. That to me is extraordinarily poetic and beautiful. The idea that he is able to actively take it away from somebody and be able to expel it from himself with very little effort, in all honesty. It's very beautiful.
You tricked us! The emotions all taste wrong. You never wanted us back at all!
Wow, you do know me well.
Fool! You've let us back in, and we will have you!
And to end it all off, we get a wonderful Thanksgiving, not only between Peter, but also Aunt May, her doctor for whatever reason, and of course Captain Gwen Stacy, somebody who we really haven't seen a lot of in this first season, but becomes very important in the last. And by the end of this first season, Peter gets the answer to his question he's been asking all season long, which is Spider-Man worth it? And well, I'll just let him answer for himself.
Spidey's not a disease that needs a cure, and he's more than just a random bug bite, too. Spider-Man is who I am. My destiny.
Again, I firmly believe this is one of the best, TV show endings, finales that I have ever seen. It even gets nice little cliffhanger at the end with Peter finally truly realizing his feelings for Gwen, and I think it's genuinely hilarious that it took his arguably greatest villain for him to realize this. I'm pretty sure dude's also still dating Liz at this time. Yeah, it's real complicated. Parker love life, man. I absolutely adore Spectacular Spider-Man to death. I very much love this show. It's one that I watched so often growing up on road trips that me and my brother completely destroyed the last disc in the Spider-Man, the Spectacular Spider-Man box set. So the last disc would work up until you got to the last 3 episodes of the season that really revolved around the black suit. Because me and my brother played it back so often, we ruined that part of the disc. How many discs and VCR tapes did I destroy as a kid because I watched it so often? It has to be a ridiculously high number. I have a lot of love in my heart for the first season of this show because I owned it on DVD and I would watch it on repeat. This Spider-Man has been and probably was always my favorite until Miles Morales showed up on the scene. And it's really great for me to get back to watching it and to truly enjoying it, as it's been a minute since I've seen the first season or even the second season, of which I didn't even know existed until I got to high school. I always just thought the show had a 1-season run and that was it, but as it turns out there's a second season. And just to think that we only really got 26 episodes of what's arguably considered the greatest high school Spider-Man adaptation out there, and that's insane to think about. Just the sheer level of impact that a 26 episode show had on Spider-Man as a character, and Josh Keaton has had on Spider-Man in my mind, as he's still the voice I hear whenever I read Spider-Man comic books, is absolutely insane. Although I definitely hear Yuri for the older Spider-Man, when I'm reading Ultimate Spider-Man comic book run that's going on right now, I hear Yuri less than I do Josh Keaton. Regardless, this show was absolutely amazing. I truly enjoyed season 1 of this show. I hope you all really enjoyed going back, and part of this is also you getting to relive some of these things. I see a lot of comments that say they go back and watch these shows after I talk about them, and I really love to see things like that. I truly appreciate each and every one of you watch. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. Your viewership is appreciated. If you want to like the video, please leave a like. It helps out the channel tremendously, and also just helps with the algorithm. If you don't like the video, feel free to leave a dislike and then comment down below telling me why you don't like the video or what I did wrong, as constructive criticism helps me to be a better creator for all of you wonderful people who watch these videos. If you want to subscribe, it's free and you can always unsub later. That's also for the algorithm. And finally, I do run a Patreon for $1 a month. You can see all these videos early, unedited, so no more freeze frames, text on screen, things of that nature. As well, you'll get to interact with me on my Discord server with a few other fans that are also a part of it. That all comes standard with the $1 tier of Patreon. And as well, if you are in the $5 or above tier, I shout out your name at the end of each and every one of these videos, just like these lovely people here. Shout out eSibert13, shout out Gabriel Lafonte, Transgers1, Video Gamer 75, Golden Boy 420, Dakota Rawson, Donovan Gomez, and MC Bomb 27. You all are amazing, and I hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day.